Okay, thank you everybody for joining us for part three, and thank you, Ken, all the way from Israel. I'd like to introduce Rabbi Fish, who needs no introduction. You all know him, our leader. So without further ado, Rabbi Fish.
Thank you, Rabbi Feigenbaum, and good morning and Boker Tov from Studio 10167 here in Jacksonville. It's a pleasure to have Ken Spiro back on here live. What an honor, what a treat. And I hope that your Zoom connection is crystal clear. It's looking like it's super crystal clear this morning without a triple scotch necessary this time. And it's really fascinating. I think we're moving on to Greece today. And but one question I have, I don't want to take up too much of your time, Ken, but I was fascinated to read in the news yesterday that the Pope visited Ur, and the birthplace of Abraham. And first of all, I wanted to know what claim the Pope, the Christians have to Abraham. But besides that, is that the Ur custom is that the authentic Ur custom, or is that a different Ur? I don't take too much time of the topic at hand, but it's something that's on our minds.
So, the quick humorous answer is, look, the Pope also wears a kippah, so I guess he can, no, he may not be that, as we'll see when we get to Rome, like that they're direct descendants of, there is a connection there from Esav, but look, on a theological level, these are the three monotheistic faiths. So without us, there wouldn't be them. As well as we're going to see today and the next few classes, we're going to talk about for sure. It's actually the ending thought for today's class on many levels. But as far as the Ur, the first I'm hearing about is what you're saying. I haven't been following the Pope's trip, so I would have to see. But if it's Ur at the bottom of the Euphrates, then it would be biblically Abraham's hometown. Yes, so maybe I'll look it up afterwards.
Okay, take it away, Ken. We're thrilled to have you on.
Great. Thank you, rabbis, for the introduction. Good to be back with you virtually in Florida, a state that's always been open. I was just telling Rabbi Feigenbaum that Israel finally has opened up at least the restaurants and things. They're supposed to be opening up the airport this week also, I hope, because it's supposed to be in Puerto Rico for a Pesach program that I missed last year. I'll believe it when I see it, but that's what they say. So as usual, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And here we go. This host disabled participant screen sharing. Rabbi, you gotta enable my screen sharing.
I just did. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, let me try that again. Okay, here we go. There it is. I'm going to try the advanced thing, see if we can get it to work. PowerPoint is a virtual background. Let's see if that's going to work. The moment of truth. Nothing's happening. Okay. I love it when things freeze on me. Share not responding. Okay, let's try that again. I hope we don't. I only have these problems with you guys. I don't think don't take it personally, but it's really weird. Seriously, never have any problems doing any of this. Let's see. Open up. Okay. Now my screen is totally.
Ken, you froze. We lost him. I guess you jinxed it by saying we had a crystal clear connection.
Yeah. Usually it's the rabbi's fault anyways. Okay, it's time for me to say some jokes. Let's get him back on.
I'm working on it. There he is.
Okay, I apologize. I said I only have technical problems with you guys. I don't know what's going on. Let me try that once more. My sincere apologies. Let's try this one more time and see if we'll get it to work now. Hopefully it will not freeze on me. Okay. Here we go. Okay. History of Hanukkah, open. There we go. Okay. Looks like we got it. My apologies. Just have to wait 1 second for this to open up, which it hopefully will do. No. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Data error is human to really mess up takes the computer. Okay. So let's go back. Quick review. We're talking about the prophecy of Daniel was how he framed this whole series of the 4 empires that he sees emerging. And we already did Babylon, we did Persia. So today we're going to be looking at the Greeks, which is that leopard with 4 heads and all those wings. We saved the scariest one for last, which is the Romans. That definitely looks the scariest, I think, for good reason. But before we launch into that, I want to do a little timeline with you guys just so we see where we're holding in terms of our Greek history, because Jewish history doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it's really good to pull out and see what else is going on in the world that gives us a much bigger understanding of what's happening in our own history. So if we look at the beginning of Greek civilization, actually goes all the way back, really to actually put 1,000 back there, BCE. But around the 7th or late 8th centuries, Greece sort of disappears off the radar of human history. Not that there's a recorded history at this time. This is prehistoric in terms of historians. We just have no idea what's really going on then. There's the Dorian invasion from the north. But Greece reemerges basically in the 5th century, the classical period of Greece, which is the one we're all familiar with the beautiful buildings, with the philosophers, the men in the togas standing outside gorgeous classical buildings discussing philosophy. And you can see what I want to focus on before we launch into the interaction with the Jewish people is to do a little bit of background so we understand who it is we're dealing with. We deal with the Greeks. So the first part of the 5th century, the Greeks are going to be fighting off an invasion of Persia. We already talked about the Persian Empire, which we interacted with in the story of Purim. But if you remember, at the end of that narrative, it is Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, who tells the Jews they can go back to the land of Israel, having been in exile for 70 years after the Babylonian destruction, and that process was going to be frozen for 14 years when the Purim story takes place. And then Darius the Persian, who, if we got it right, would be the son of Esther and Ahasuerus. It's during his reign, right after the Purim miracle, that after 14 years of being frozen, that the temple is finally completed 70 years after the destruction. That's when Ezra and Nehemiah are back in the land of Israel, physically rebuilding and spiritually rebuilding a Jewish presence in the land, with now Jerusalem rebuilt with the temple. So that's the background to Persia. The first about 36 years of the Second Temple period are control of the Persians, but we have a new empire on the scene, the Greeks. And before the Greeks are going to take over Persia, which is later in our narrative, the Persians try and take over Greece also. The first part of the 5th century, there's a series of attempts by the Persian Empire to conquer Greece. And they're not successful. They're defeated in a couple of major battles. One of the most famous is the Battle of the Marathon in 490 BCE, which is where the race takes its name from. because at that time the Persians were blockading the city of Athens from the sea, and also trying to land on the other side a military force to blockade Athens from land. The Greek army stops the Athenians at the beachfront, and then a Greek runner, there you can see him over there in the bottom, Theodippides, runs 26.5 miles, which is the length, by the way, of the race today. You can see in the little map here, you can see there's Athens on this side and there's the marathon on the other. He runs 26.5 miles pretty much across this entire landmass from the plains of the marathon to the city of Athens. He says Nike, which is the Greek word for victory, also the Greek goddess for victory, and then he drops dead. What do you learn from that? I always say train for a marathon race, but don't run one. The first guy who didn't last very long after. Also, there's the great battle of Salamis, where a much smaller Greek fleet is able to destroy a much larger Persian fleet. Another famous battle where 300 Spartans under King Leonidas will hold off the entire Persian armies, the Battle of Thermopylae, made famous by the movie The 300, if any of you have actually seen it. Well, all this is based on, by the way, the earliest historical writings in Western history, which are two Greek writers. One is named Herodotus and one is named Thucydides. And Herodotus wrote a book called The Wars for Greece. And it's the first description we have, first historical accounts in the Western world. This is when history actually begins in the West. As a matter of fact, the famous Jewish historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, he writes, he says, if Herodotus is the father of history, in the West, he's talking about the fathers of meaning in history are the Jewish people, which is actually very true. So after the Greeks finish fighting off the Persians and prevent their absorption into the Persian Empire, they then go back to doing what they do very well, because Greece is not a united kingdom. It's a series of city-states like Italy was all the way until the 19th century, where you can see some of the city-states there. You have Attica, you have Sparta, you have Athens, Macedonia in the north. You have the Peloponnesian Wars, which are basically wars between warring Greek kingdoms, primarily focusing on Sparta, the great militarized Greek city-state, where boys were separated from the age of 7 and thrown naked into military camps where they had to fight for their food and survival. It's an entire country was based on training soldiers to be fighting machines from first grade onward. And the whole economy was based on a slave-based economy. Athens fights Sparta in the series of wars. Athens was the naval power. Sparta was the great infantry power. Sparta beats Athens in the Peloponnesian Wars. But as we get to the end of the 5th century and we enter the 4th century before the Common Era, you're going to have sweeping out of the north, the Macedonians. But before we talk about them, because this is very relevant to the battles that we're going to fight with the Greeks, we have to talk a little bit about the Greeks and their military. And I happen to love military history. The only thing I like more than military history is Jewish history. But the Greeks had a citizen army. Which means that they didn't have a professional army like you have in America today. Citizens had to supply themselves with their equipment and fight during military campaigns, which were always centered around certain times of the year when you were in farming. Because when you were farming, you had to be either planting or harvesting, and it wasn't a good time to go to war. So people actually literally took breaks at certain seasons and did not military campaign. But the Greeks basically invented two things that are very interesting and are going to relate to the whole narrative of our battle with them. Number one is they invented the idea of pitched warfare, of huge battles of tremendous numbers of men fighting very intensely in a large battle, all out fighting. And remember, back then you could see this is Greek armor. You're wearing bronze armor that weighs about 80 pounds. With a huge heavy shield and a very long spear. And imagine you're campaigning in the summer in very hot heat. How long do you think you could keep that up for? These battles always lasted like less than an hour usually, because you were too exhausted afterwards. The Greeks also invented the idea of the phalanx, and you can see it demonstrated here, which were these men who fought in close formation with these huge spears that were up to 21 feet long, with the first 5 rows of spears facing down. And when two Greek armies would fight each other, the phalanxes would just press on each other until one side broke. Herodotus, describing Greeks fighting, would describe how the phalanx would pivot around counterclockwise because everyone is holding their spear in their right hand and their shield in their left hand. Your vulnerable side is going to be your right side because your shield isn't covering where your spear is. So everyone would lean into the guy next to him to get behind their shield. So the phalanxes would pivot. One phalanx would eventually break. You'd have a lot of casualties quickly, and they'd run off the battlefield, abandoning their weapons often, and that would be the end of the battle. So that was the Greeks in warfare, which is going to prove to be a very formidable force in history, fighting not only each other, but other military powers, including in the Maccabee story. This is what we're up against, a very serious military machine. So that's the Greeks in warfare. But in the beginning of the 4th century, you're going to have, coming from the north, you're going to have Philip of Macedon. And the Macedonians, Macedonia is today a separate country since the 1990s, when all of that part of the world fell apart with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the Macedonians were considered by the other southern Greeks to be barbarians. But this barbarian Philip was able to do something that no other Greek had ever done. He's able to literally conquer all of Greece and unite it for the first time under one kingdom. So Philip of Macedon is fighting in his army already at the age of 18 as a general, as his son Alexander of Macedon. We know him as Alexander the Great, and he's going to be a very important character in our narrative discussing Greek interaction with the Jewish people, because as we see, he's going to be the first Greek that we meet. But Alexander the Great, and it's really cool because here you have Jewish history meeting Western history for the first time. Until this time, guys, think of who we dealt with. We dealt with Egypt. We dealt with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians. These are our neighbors to the northeast and to the southwest. The guys in the northeast are culturally and linguistically very similar to us. The languages are the same, but this is the first time we're actually going to deal with a civilization that's coming across the largest inland sea in the world, the Mediterranean, the Greeks. So Alexander is a general in his father's army at a very young age, very skilled and amazing military leader, one of the greatest of all time. Philip is murdered by one of his own Greeks in middle age, and Alexander the Great will assume the role of taking over a unified Greek empire. And here we have some images of Alexander the Great, who, despite the movie they made with who's that guy? Which actor? They had him as a blonde. Alexander the Great was not blonde. Greeks are Mediterranean people. They're olive-skinned and dark-haired. You can see this is not a contemporary image of him, but he's portrayed with black hair. Here you can see Alexander portrayed in all these images. He was no slouch even intellectually. His personal private tutor for 2 years was Aristotle. So that's what they had back then. You had people who were great warriors and also scholars. I wouldn't call him necessarily an intellectual, but he was certainly not an ignoramus either. But Alexander the Great is going to inherit from his father, Philip of Macedon, united Greece, and embark on one of the most amazing military campaigns in all of human history. He is basically going to invade the Persian Empire, which is an incredible story because that would be the equivalent of Israel declaring war on NATO. That's how lopsided the battles were. Literally, he will take an army of maximum of 45,000 men, and he will campaign for 12 years over 10,000 miles. You can see in the map over here, Alexander the Great's campaign, starting in 334 before the Common Era till 323. And in a series of battles, 3 great battles, Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, Alexander the Great will do an insane tactic which will work all 3 times, which he will basically charge directly at the center of the Persian line. The Persians fielded massive armies of up to maybe 400,000 men. These are armies you will not see again in the world until basically that size until 100 years ago. You just didn't have populations big enough. And the Persians will use a massive army of not just Persian soldiers, even Greek mercenaries. The Greeks, they will have their own phalanx against the Greek phalanx. Alexander the Great, by the way, is almost killed in the first battle, in the first few minutes of the battle, when he charges across the Granicus River in his heavy cavalry. He's wounded by a Persian cavalryman, and then his boyfriend bodyguard, Alexander the Great, had quite a wild life on every level. Clytus will dispatch the Persian, thus saving his life. One of my favorite books I've read in a very long time. Years ago I read it. It was called What If? And it's counterfactual history, meaning what if this had happened instead of that? What if the Japanese had won the Battle of Midway? What if this General Lee had won the Battle of Gettysburg? That would have been it for the Civil War. The North would have had to basically end the war there, and everything would have been different. What if Alexander the Great, the first opening story in What If is, what if Alexander the Great was killed at the Battle of Granicus in his first attack against the Persian Empire? Greek civilization would never have conquered Persia. The Persian Empire would never have ceased to exist, and all of human history in the West would absolutely be different today. It's a very interesting thing to speculate on, but not our topic. Anyway, amazingly enough, like the French fighting the British in the 100 Years' War at Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, they repeat the same mistake 3 times, charging into the French cavalry, charging into the British archers and getting slaughtered by them. So too, all 3 times Alexander the Great charges directly at the center of the Persian line, where Darius the emperor is standing behind his immortals, his personal bodyguard. All 3 times, despite the suicidal nature of the attack, it's successful. The immortals break. Darius flees the battle scene. The Persian line collapses. By the 3rd battle, which is Galgamela, Darius is killed by his own men. You've chickened out too many times. He's murdered by his own men after the battle. Alexander the Great will continue on campaigning. He will get all the way out to India. And you can see in the scene there where he meets elephants, which the Greeks will later incorporate in the Hanukkah story. You want to know where the Greek, these were the tanks of the ancient Near East. The only reason he stopped fighting was his men burned out after 12 years. It said when he looked at his empire, he cried because there was nothing left to conquer. And by the way, Alexander the Great, since I'm so obsessed with military history, his greatness, if any of you are planning to embark on a career of being a great military leader, you got to remember the 2 rules of all great military leaders, be they Alexander the Great, be they Ariel Sharon, be they William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses Grant, or be they Judah the Maccabee. You have to always be on the offensive and always do the unexpected. And that is Alexander the Great. By the way, and we're gonna veer off this topic and go into the Jewish stuff in just a minute, but he will literally disassemble the Persian Empire. The Greeks, unlike other peoples, are cultural imperialists. They will literally settle where they conquer. 6 cities will be named Alexandria after him, built throughout the Persian Empire, which was quite vast, extending all the way at one point down into Egypt. That's early on. Only one of those cities will survive, which will be the Alexandria at the Nile Delta, all the way over here at the top, which in its heyday, later in history, will be the most enlightened city probably in the world, with the largest library in the world, the city that was, by the way, 1/3 Jewish before the Bar Kokhba revolt and Kitos's war. We're jumping ahead of ourselves about 500 years, but and Alexander the Great will take on the trappings and the external appearance of a Persian emperor. When cultures meet, they synthesize. The Greek language will be brought to the Middle East, and it will turn into a dialect of the Greek language called the Koine, which will be the sort of international upper class language of the entire Mediterranean. But it's a really cool, and it will have this cultural synthesis of Western culture meeting the Middle East and then meeting Jewish culture is going to have a very significant impact on Jewish history and absolutely all of human history. So if we go back to our timeline just for a second here, you can see here we have at 334 to Alexander the Great to 323 should actually be. When Alexander the Great dies in 323, his empire does not survive him. It's divided between several of his generals. So that's the end of a united Greece. But it's during that time, during this military campaign over here, before his empire will divide, that he is going to detour to the south through what is today Lebanon. He will take the city of Tyre in one of the most amazing sieges in human history, because Tyre was an island fortress. He will build a huge bridge going out to the island to besiege the fortress. The Phoenicians in Tyre will destroy it. He will rebuild it and take the city. Then he will head down through what is today Lebanon. Then he will head into what is the Galilee of today. Living up there at the time will be the not so good Samaritans. You guys all know about the Samaritans because we know about them from the Christian Bible. My general rule is anyone the Christian Bible, the gospel says is good, from our perspective is bad, and vice versa. The Samaritans were really not good. The Samaritans had, if you remember from the previous class, been placed by the Assyrians in northern Israel. They are originally from somewhere else in the east. Just as they took the 10 tribes of the north out and exiled them to the east, they took someone from the east and put them in Israel as a way of pacifying them. And the Samaritans were never accepted by the Jewish people, as they tried to convert because they were being eaten by the wild animals up there, and they figured if they become Jewish, it'll be safer for them. Their conversion was insincere and not accepted, and they always had it in for us. So they never liked us, and they always, whenever they can, they're the ones who are going to send the letter to Cyrus of Persia, telling him, don't let the Jews rebuild the temple. Now the temple's rebuilt. Now when Alexander the Great is marching through their territory, they come out to greet him, and they tell him, hey, there's these Jews south of us in a city called Jerusalem with a temple. They're horrible people. You better go destroy their city and burn their temple down. So Alexander the Great is marching down to meet them. Meanwhile, if we hit the pause button, let's look at the timeline below, because I put down below a timeline showing you what's going on in the Jewish world at the time. So we have the first temple period here until 422 BCE. We have the exile, and then we have the return in 352 BCE, the second temple period. We are back. If you look in the Ethics of the Fathers, which is in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, it gives us the chain of transmission. And it says, Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. We talked about those guys last time. The men of the great assembly, who existed from 410 to 310 BCE, were 120 rabbis, an expanded Jewish Sanhedrin, an expanded Jewish Supreme Court that ruled in Babylon. And as the exile ends and Jews return, that men of the great assembly will die out, and the Sanhedrin will be reconstituted in the land of Israel. So, but then what it says is, back down here, it says, Shimon HaTzadik Haya Mishire Knesset Hagadol. He was one of the last of the men of the great assembly. He was the last, and he is the Gadol Ador, the chief rabbi of his generation, one of the last surviving men of the great assembly, and he's also the high priest. And Shimon HaTzadik is going to be the rabbi in our story, this great spiritual leader of the Jewish people, who is going to end up interacting with Alexander the Great. The Jews in Jerusalem get news that Alexander the Great, the greatest military conqueror of his age, is marching down to destroy Jerusalem. What does Shimon HaTzadik do? He does something you're not supposed to do. He dresses himself in the robes of the high priest, which he was, but all 8 of the priestly garments we just read about recently in the weekly Torah readings, including the things you only wear in the temple, like the tzitz on the top of the forehead that says holy to God, the breastplate, the whole outfit. You're never supposed to wear that outside the temple. And he dresses the high priest, and he goes to what is today Rosh Hashanah. Look on a map of Israel after the clash, you'll see where Rosh Hashanah is, to intercept Alexander the Great, to get to him before he gets to Jerusalem. And what happens is a fantastic interaction that's recorded in 2 stories. It's recorded in the great Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who is not at all contemporary with this event. He lives hundreds of years later in the 1st century of the Common Era. It's also recorded in the Talmud. The 2 stories are similar, with the one difference. Josephus's account does not mention Shimon HaTzadik. It mentions a different high priest, but that's not so important for our narrative. But if you look in the Talmud and Tractate Yuma, it describes the meeting. And this is the first time, this is incredible. This is when one of the greatest characters of Western history is going to meet one of the great rabbis. Greece meets the Jews for the first time in history. When Alexander the Great saw Shimon HaTzadik, he descended from his chariot and bowed before him. His escort said to him, his escort is his general, Pomario, who is his father's general. This is like his most trusted, oldest military commander. He said, should an important king such as you bow to this Jew? He said to them, Alexander replies, I do so because the image of this man's face is victorious before me on my battlefields, meaning before he goes into battle, he sees that he saw an image of Shimon HaTzadik, and he interpreted it as a good omen. When I fight, I see his image going before me as a sign of victory, and therefore I know that he has supreme sanctity. Really interesting story. Okay, again, reported in 2 Jewish places. So he not only doesn't destroy Jerusalem, he greets Shimon HaTzadik with tremendous respect. Alexander the Great, who was not very big, he may have been small, but he had a lot of aggression, gets off his famous horse, one of the most famous horses in history, called Bucephalus, not syphilis, Bucephalus. Alexander the Great, no doubt, suffered from that disease, as he probably suffered from a lot of diseases from his wild life and all of his adventures and wounds. But he didn't bow to anyone. So it shows you how unique this event is, that he would bow to this Jewish high priest who happens to be the leading rabbi of his generation. And then the next interaction is interesting. It goes on to say, he, Alexander, said to the representatives of the Jewish people, "Why have you come?" They said to him, "Is it possible that the temple, the house in which we pray for you and for your kingdom, not be destroyed? Gentiles will try to mislead you into destroying it." Meaning he's trying to basically outmaneuver the Samaritans. "And we would remain silent and not tell you, like, you're going to destroy our temple, we're going to stand here. We pray for your good luck." He said to them, "Who are these people who want to destroy it?" It's just like the Esther story when Ahasuerus says, "Mihu zevezehu," like, who's the guy who wants to kill you? The Jews said to him, "They are these Samaritans who stand before you." This is it's such a parallel thing to the Purim narrative, where the Jews totally blindside the Samaritans who are right there. He, Alexander, says to them, "If so, they are delivered into your hands to deal with as you please." And the Jews just trash the Samaritans. You can't be merciful to your enemies. They're going to destroy you. It's such an interesting interaction. But out of that, Alexander the Great will become one of the few people to peacefully conquer Jerusalem without a fight. And we're told that, by the way, one of the things he wanted to do was put up like an image of him in the temple. Something like that would have triggered a massive revolt. So the rabbis, being smart, said, "You know what? We'll do better than that. Why honor your image in the temple? We're going to command that every one of the firstborn sons of this generation be named Alexander." And by the way, until today, Alexander, which is often shortened to the word sender, is considered a Jewish name. And I know rabbis who are named Sender. That's a name. Interesting point. But this is going to begin one of the most interesting interactions that we will ever have with anyone in human history, which is Judaism versus Hellenism. Hellenism is Hellas, is the Greek word for Greece. So I hear Hellenism. And you could see, I deliberately put up a temple on the left, and I got the Parthenon, the most beautiful classical building ever built, on the right, which was actually in very good condition until the Ottoman Turks, who conquered Greece and ruled over it for quite a long time, stupidly stored gunpowder in the building and used it as an ammunition depot. And then some Turkish soldier or something lit a cigarette near it and blew the roof off of it. So if you go there today, it's missing its roof. But you could see the Greek alphabet and the Hebrew alphabet. It's such an interesting interaction. The Greeks had never met anyone like the Jews. We were unlike anyone else. Remember, at this time, there are no other monotheists in the world. Everyone else is a variation on the same theme of polytheism. You went into the Parthenon, and there's a big statue of Athena there. And you travel to another country, you, out of courtesy, worship their gods, even if they weren't part of your religion. But here you have these Jews who have this one infinite, invisible God in this temple in Jerusalem that has no images or idols. If you read what Greek and Roman writers write about the temple in Jerusalem and the Jews, they talk about how bizarre these people are, and that they have this largest, in the Roman Empire, we're getting ahead of myself, it was the largest religious site on the planet Earth, but there was no statues in it. This was unheard of. They never met a people who had such a deep philosophical, spiritual literacy. And I just disappeared off of my own screen again. Hold on one second. There I am. That happens occasionally. And so that's the Greeks meeting us. There's actually very little references in Greek writings to interacting with Jews and Jewish wisdom. We talk a lot more about them. We'd never met anyone like them. Like I said, these are not our neighbors like the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, or Egyptians. These are people who came from across the sea. They're in every way racially, culturally, linguistically completely different. They had a profound philosophical culture. They had Plato, and they had Socrates, and they had Aristotle, and they had this beautiful sense of the aesthetic and city planning and buildings and this whole idea of, and a whole literary tradition. And they had theater. The theater that the Romans used, that we use today, is based on what the Greeks brought into the world. The Romans took a lot of Greek culture and spread it around the world. And they had a language that was considered so beautiful, not the Koine, not the hybrid language that the language metamorphosized in when it met Persia, just as we see the Latin-based languages turned into other languages, Romance languages like Italian and French and Portuguese and Spanish. But the original pure Greek language was considered to be such a beautiful language Believe it or not, it was considered to be kosher to write a Torah scroll in. Look, here's the Megillah, Talmud Megillah, 8b. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, even with regard to Torah scrolls, the sages permitted them to be written only in Greek. Torah scrolls written in any other language do not have the sanctity of a Torah scroll. Isn't that wild? I think that is unbelievably interesting. It was considered, the Talmud says there was 10 portions of beauty given to language and 9 were given to the Greek language. It's considered the most perfect language in terms of being able to express things. Very interesting. And the Greeks had this beautiful philosophical tradition, which had a completely different way of looking at the world. And this is going to prove to be very problematic for us. It's interesting that even today you can read in codes of Jewish law prohibitions against studying Greek philosophy in general, because it could lead you to go off the derech, go in the wrong direction. I always laugh at it and I say, I wish I had a student who was so intellectual that he would study philosophy and decide to go in a different direction. Most people don't read anything anymore. But at the time, the Greeks, who were such profound thinkers with such a beautiful language, it was considered on one point, in one hand, it's kind of like chocolate. It's so delicious, but it's so deadly to eat so much of it. And you can see the rabbinic reaction to philosophy. It talks about when it says, Ben Dama, son of Rabbi Yishmael's sister, asked Rabbi Yishmael, in the case of one such as I, who has learned the entire Torah, what is the halacha with regards to studying Greek wisdom? Rabbi Yishmael recited this verse about him. He says, this Torah scroll shall not depart from your mouth, and you shall contemplate it day and night. He says, go and search for an hour that is neither part of the day nor part of the night and learn Greek wisdom in it. Meaning, stay away from the stuff. It's bad news. People were really attracted to it, but because they were on such a different level intellectually and spiritually, it could prove to be extremely problematic if you studied too much Greek philosophy, and you'll see it will end up causing massive problems in the Jewish world. But not only that, the Greeks will be the first people to translate the Bible into another language. Say the Bible's translated into every language on the planet Earth. It's the biggest seller of all time. If we could just get some royalties off of it, can you imagine? No yeshiva guy would have to ever pay tuition, or no day school. They'd all be for free, literally. But that already tells you, for another culture to translate our book into their language says something about the Greek interest in Judaism and in our wisdom. And this is during the reign of Ptolemy II, because what happens is when Alexander the Great dies, his empire is going to split into the Greek Empire in Greece, led by his general Menelaus. But then there's going to be a Greek Empire in Egypt, led by a series of kings. It's going to be called the Ptolemaic, with the P is silent, the Ptolemaic Greek Empire. Every one of the kings is going to be called Ptolemy. And we're going to have a Greek Empire to the north, which is in Syria, which is going to be called the Seleucid Empire. So you can have 3 big empires, and every king there is going to be called Antiochus. So now we know where the name, it's a generic term. Like you have King George I, King George II, King George II, the third and the fourth and the fifth. So you're going to have Ptolemy I, second, third. It's during the reign of Ptolemy II in approximately 250 BCE. This is long after Alexander the Great is dead, and long after we, at this period of time, were absorbed into the Ptolemaic Greek Empire. So after Alexander's death, we find ourselves part of the Greek Empire that is centered in Egypt. All those queens you heard of named Cleopatra that we'll talk about next week, they're all Greek women. It's funny because, what's her name? Gal Gadot just got the role. You guys know Gal Gadot, right? The Israeli actress who plays Wonder Woman. She was chosen to be Cleopatra in a movie. And all the woke people went nuts on her. How dare you pick her? You got to pick a black woman. You got to pick an Arab woman. So, of course, I was going to write back immediately. Then I saw like 40 people jumped in and said, excuse me, Cleopatra is Greek Mediterranean white woman. Anyway, it was very funny. The only thing you could say wrong about Gal Gadot is she's Ashkenazi. Maybe they should have picked a Sephardi woman to do it, more Middle Eastern. I thought that was quite interesting. But So Ptolemy will take 70 rabbis and lock them in 70 rooms. Here's the narrative. Here's described in the Talmud Megillah. It says, the Gemara continues, and this was due to the incident of King Ptolemy, as it is taught in a brisa. I'm not going to go into what that is. There was an incident involving King Ptolemy of Egypt, who assembled 72 elders from the sages of Israel and put them in 72 separate rooms, and did not reveal to them for what purpose he had assembled them, so they would not coordinate their responses. He entered and approached each and every one of them and said to each of them, write for me a translation of the Torah of Moses, your teacher, meaning do it in Greek. The Holy One, blessed be he, placed wisdom in the hearts of each and every one, and they all agreed to one common understanding. Not only did they all translate the text correctly, they all introduced the same changes into the translated text. This text is the most famous translation of the Hebrew Bible ever done. It's called the Septuagint, which comes from the word 70, or Targum's Shivim, the translation of the 70. What did these guys do? They knew to change certain things. Like in the beginning, I'll give you one example. We do a whole class on this. It says in the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, when God's creating the world, he says, Na'aseh Adam b'tzelmenu. Let us make man in our image. What's the obvious question there if you know Hebrew? Who's God talking to? So Rashi, the great medieval commentator, jumps in and says, oh, he's talking to the angels, whatever that means. God consulted with the other spiritual forces. But if you give the translation, let us make, to a bunch of polytheists, what are they going to say? You see, these Jews believe multiple gods. So they all translated it into singular in Hebrew, that kind of stuff. By the way, this day, when the translation was done, became a fast day that we no longer hold by. There's a lot more fast days in Jewish history than we keep. You know why? Because we Jews are obsessed with eating. And if we don't get to eat, if we had to fast as many days as there were real fast days, we'd all have post-traumatic stress disorder. Fressing is the Yiddish word for pigging out instead of stress disorder. So they like to condense a lot of the fast days into one. But this was considered a fast day. Why is it a happy day? Are we happy that other people want to learn our Torah? No, because the reality is, yes, it's a blessing and a curse, as are Christianity and Islam. We're not going to get into that now. But ever since the non-Jewish world has got a hold of our book, not only are they not paying us royalties for it, they've been beating us over the head with the book and using it against us. But we see, the point is, there's a very serious interest of these two cultures, one in the other. And this cross-pollinization, for better and also for worse. And out of this group, let me go back for a second. Out of the next rabbi mentioned, I should have put it in the slides here. We have this guy, Antigonus Ish Socho, comes after Shimon HaTzadik. And Antigonus was the head of the Sanhedrin. And we know he had two students named Tzadok and Botus, who were almost certainly influenced by Greek philosophy and Greek thought. And they went off the derech, so to speak. It corrupted their hashkafa, their Jewish worldview. And they will create, for the first time in Jewish history, we're going to have offshoots of mainstream Judaism. Today, we got lots of offshoots of Judaism. We have, later in history, we're going to have Karaites, and then we're going to have the Reform and the Reconstructionist, the conservative movement, and all these other stuff coming out. These are offshoots of mainstream. The trunk is Torah observant Judaism, which has itself evolved, but things are broken away. This begins in the Second Temple period and continues until today. But the first major offshoot of Torah Judaism, I hate the word orthodoxy. Maybe we'll do a class at a later date on that one. The origins of that whole term is fascinating. But this is the first schism, the first breakaway group. Tzadok and Botus will have students who will also not be correct thinking Jews, and they will found Baitumim and Sadukim, two groups of heretical Jews that we know today in English as the Sadducees. You've heard of that word, right? Sadukim. And these are the first major schism. And Josephus tells us about these guys, the great Jewish historian living later in history. He says, but the Sadukim are those that compose the second order. He's talking about first the Perushim, the rabbis, the Sanhedrin, and exclude fate entirely and suppose that God is not concerned with our doing. These are major hashkafa problems, major problems from Jewish worldview, that God doesn't enact in history, that not doing and with our doing or not doing what is evil. They say that to do what is good or what is evil is man's own choice. That's a little more complicated. It is actually, there's free will involved in it, but there's a notion that God doesn't act in history, that they basically denied the oral law and anything that isn't explicitly said in the Torah, ideas of life after death. And that the choice of one or another belongs to each person who may act as he pleases. They exclude the belief in immortality of the soul and in punishment and reward of the afterworld, because it doesn't say explicitly in 5 books of Moses, that kind of stuff. It's basically attacking the authority of the rabbis, but you're going to have these schisms. And this is going to prove to be, Tzaddukim are going to be a huge problem throughout the entire Second Temple period. The entire priesthood of the Second Temple period is going to be overwhelmingly Tzadduki priests who will deliberately do things wrong because they don't hold by the different traditions that were passed down orally about how you did things in the temple. And if you read the Mishnah, you'll see, by the way, in the Mishnah talking about Sukkot, where the high priest pours the water and the wine offering on the altar instead of pouring them down the holes, and everyone throws their esrogim at him, or the high priest on Yom Kippur, rather than offering the incense inside the Holy of Holies, will offer it outside deliberately to show that he doesn't hold by Jewish tradition. So you can see how destructive this is going to be. You can have schism. The rabbis are going to be under attack. Breakaway groups are going to be threatening mainstream Judaism. Very, very destructive stuff, but not the worst thing that's going to happen to us by any stretch of the imagination. Meanwhile, back to our story. So you can see the Greek empires over here. You can have the Greek Empire in Greece, which, by the way, already by the middle of the 2nd century, right at the time of the Hanukkah narrative, we're going to get to in just a couple of minutes, Greece itself will be absorbed by the Roman Empire. It'll no longer be an independent kingdom. It'll be a client state of the Roman Empire. But meanwhile, we, the Jewish people, are sandwiched between the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. Initially, as I said, up through basically the year 198 before the Common Era will be part of the Ptolemaic Empire. But then in the battle in the north, because these two kingdoms are fighting each other, in 198 BCE, the Seleucids will defeat the Ptolemies at the Battle of Banyas, which is up north in Israel. And then Israel become part of the Seleucid kingdom of Syria. The problem is we, the Jews, largely remain loyal to Judaism. Even Sadduki Jews did not become Greekified. There were, however, a significant minority of Jews who got totally drawn into Greek culture and became Hellenized. This is going to be the root of the whole story of Hanukkah, and it's going to explode into the open rebellion. As I always say when I'm teaching history, there are few things worse than Jews trying to out-Gentile Gentiles and being Gentiles. Self-hating Jews who are trying to deny their identity have proven throughout history to be very destructive people for us. And we're going to see that in the story. These Jews will get completely into Greek culture, believing that Judaism is antiquated. The modern hip culture of the West is Greece, with their art, their architecture, their theater, their sporting events. The Greeks were totally into sports. The Olympics begin in Greece thousands of years ago, literally. By the way, all Greek sports were done only by men, only witnessed by men. The Greeks were not really they were a very misogynist world, not really into women very much at all. They were all done completely in the nude, including wrestling was done in the nude with your body coated with olive oil, then you rolled in sand. Otherwise, you grab the guy and he'd go flying out. The Greeks, by the way, practiced their sports in a building called the gymnasium, which comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. This was a major feature of Greek culture. And by the way, the Greeks were horrified by things like circumcision, believing it was mutilation of the body. And trust me, when you were performing, everyone saw exactly whether you were circumcised or not. These Hellenized Jews were so into Greek culture that they completely dumped their Judaism, became completely Greek, and some of them even underwent a surgical procedure to have their circumcision undone. I have no idea what that means, and it sounds incredibly painful. But you could show you how how self-hating these people were. So you have a perfect storm of a small but very influential group of Hellenized Jews who are upper class people of influence. Like you see people who are embedded in things like the media and Hollywood, and they're people who are big influencers. What they say carries a lot of weight. Combine that with the geopolitical realities of the Seleucid Empire. They don't like the fact that the only people who aren't becoming Greek are these Jews. And this is the country that's on the border with our Ptolemaic enemies, and they're not really loyal to Greek culture. We can't really trust these guys. And they're also on the Eastern Mediterranean. They're a very weak underbelly of our empire. The Romans, if they decide to invade, they're going to be able to march right in, and they're not going to stop. These people aren't loyal to our culture. So this combination is going to trigger the Hanukkah narrative, which we're going to see is first and foremost, it's grossly oversimplified and misunderstood. The trigger for Hanukkah is basically this small influential minority of Hellenized Jews who are going to sick the Greek authorities of the Seleucid kingdom on not Jews, but Judaism. We're going to help our fellow Jews who insist upon sticking to their antiquated, outmoded, weird Jewish ideas. We're going to help them become Greek. Few things are as dangerous in history as people like this. The same thing will repeat itself later in history. You'll see it, for instance, in the enlightened Jews of Russia during the 19th century, who will hire themselves out to the Tsarist Russian government to help their fellow Jews leave their Judaism behind and become Russified, more Russian. And they will, and Jews are the most, a Jew who understands what makes Judaism tick is the most potentially destructive person for the Jewish people. A non-Jew doesn't understand what makes Jews tick, and they think we can't survive without kosher sushi and kosher corned beef and good mustard and dill pickles. But Jews who know what makes Jews tick understand what keeps Jews Jewish is Jews keeping Judaism. It's our holidays, our Torah, our calendar, are the rituals we keep, such as circumcision. They will sick the Seleucids on the Jews and tell them to go after Judaism, outlawing things like circumcision, outlawing the calendar. This is history's first religious ideological war. The first thing we have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, about Hanukkah is it wasn't the Greeks trying to destroy Jews. It was Hellenized Jews sicking the Greeks not on Jews, but on Judaism. Had we Jews just given up our Judaism, all of history would be different. But had we done that, they would have left us alone. And so they will. So this is the first religious ideological war in human history. In the ancient world, you never went after other people's faiths. You swapped your gods like baseball cards. You can see in this whole story, by the way, is recorded in the books of the Maccabees. There are multiple books of the Maccabees. First and Second Maccabees are canonical books of the Catholic Bible, meaning they're included in the Catholic Bible because they wanted to have textual continuity between the end of our Bible, which is the beginning of the Second Temple period, and the Jesus narrative, and this fits right in the middle. There are also books written by Jews. One is, First Maccabees is written by a royal chronicler of the Maccabean dynasty, and it gives us the whole history of the struggle. The second book of Maccabees is a condensed version in Greek of an earlier book that was written in Hebrew, written by a man by the name of Jason of Cyrene, who lived in North Africa. This is where we get the narrative from. These books are not in our Bible because they're not written by prophets. They were written, if you remember the last class, we talked about the closing of the Hebrew Bible by the men of the Great Assembly. But these books nevertheless give us the historical narrative, and they're written from the Jewish perspective. It says, not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their fathers and to cease to live by the laws of God, and also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call it the temple of Olympian Zeus. So you see what the Greeks are going after is Judaism, Jewish observance, and desecrating the temple. Remember, the temple was the central focus of Jewish worship. And this is what is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back and leads to the revolt. And that revolt will break out in the city of Modi'in, which is not the modern city of Modi'in where my daughter lives, where I was yesterday for Shabbat. It's across the street, is on a road called the 443 road, which is actually the traditional route that you take to get from the coast of Israel up to Jerusalem, which goes through Modi'in and Givat Ze'ev. It's 11 kilometers shorter than the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway of today. Into that village will show, a Greek garrison will show up in the village with Jews and demand that a Jew sacrifice a pig to the god Jupiter, which is just to show you how much you've dumped your Judaism behind. Stepping out of the crowd will come Matityahu, and he makes a speech, by the way. First, they want him to do it. They want to get the elder of the community. And he says, even if all the nations that live under the rules of the kings obey him and all chose to do his commandments, departing each one from his religion of his fathers, yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenant of my fathers. We will not obey the king's word by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. So he refuses to do it. So a Hellenized Jew, a Greekified Jew says, I'll do it, no problem. He steps out of the crowd. Mattathias isn't going to tolerate that. He jumps out of the crowd, stabs the Jew. They grab all the Greek soldiers. They kill them. They know the Greeks going to come back and like level the village and kill everyone and as revenge for the killing of Greek soldiers. So he issues the famous cry, Mila Hashem Elai, who is for the Lord, follow me. And he flees with his sons into the mountains, and he is going to organize a guerrilla army. And you can see here is the family tree of Mattathias, and he had 5 sons. These names are actually not the names we understand in Judaism. I got this from off the website. You have Jonathan, you have Jonathan, Shimon, You have Judah the Maccabee. He's the most famous of all of them. The term Maccabee, which means either hammer, or it's an acronym for Mi Kamocha B'Lim Hashem, who is like you among the powers, O God. He is going to be the great military leader. You're going to have Eliezer and Jonathan. So these are the 5 sons who are going to be involved in the revolt. The greatest of all is going to be Judah Maccabee. And you could see as we go to the next image here, is a famous classical painting of Judah Maccabee. You can see the various military campaigns. Remember what I said about great military leaders? You got to be on the offensive and do the unexpected. He is taking on Greek armies that outnumber him easily every time 10-1. He has armies as few as sometimes a few hundred men, but he does. All these battles will take place in this 443 road of today, trying to ambush the Greeks as they're coming uphill to get to Jerusalem, using incredible elements of surprise, always doing the unexpected. And he trashes Greek armies, even Greek armies that are bringing the elephants that Alexander the Great had discovered in India, the tanks of the ancient Near East. He, in a series of Beit Horon, Emmaus, again, you could read about them if you're interested. Get a copy of the Book of the Maccabees in English. And he's very successful. After 3 years of fighting, they finally get to Jerusalem and liberate the city. And that is when the story of the Hanukkah, the rededication of the altar, takes place, when the temple is cleaned out and returned again into a monotheistic site, having been converted into the pagan site to the god Jupiter, or Zeus for the Greeks, Jupiter, Roman god Jupiter. Same guy. And you can see in the Book of the Maccabees, it describes early in the morning, the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, they, the priests, rose and offered sacrifices as the law directs on the new altar of burnt. That's what Hanukkah Tamizbech, the story of Hanukkah, is to dedicate the altar, which they had built. They had to tear the old one down because anything used for idolatry is not reusable. It was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals, and they celebrated dedication after the 8 days. So interesting that it's what's missing from the account is anything about the little flask of oil. By the way, the battle is going to go on off and on for 25 years. He's going to be fighting off and on with the Greeks. And during that fighting, Judah is going to fall, Eliezer is going to fall. Most of the Maccabean sons of Mattathias, who dies, he actually dies of He's not murdered. He's not killed. But either all the sons pretty much will all be either killed in battle or murdered in plots afterwards. This is not a quick victory. This is not the Purim story. It's a lot of people die. A lot of the heroes of the story are killed. The sea doesn't split. Plagues don't destroy our enemies. But you notice what's missing from this is the whole account of the oil. And there's very little said in Jewish sources actually about the story of Hanukkah. If you look in Tractate Shabbat, page 21b, it says, the Gemara says, what is Hanukkah, my Hanukkah? And why are the lights kindled on Hanukkah? The Gemara answers, the sages taught in the Megillah and Taanis, on the 25th day of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. One may not eulogize them and one may not fast on them. What is the reason? When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary by touching them. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious over them, which was after 3 years of fighting, they searched and found only one. This is the only story we have of this oil thing burning. Cruse of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest, undisturbed by the Greeks. And there was sufficient oil there to light the candelabra for 1 day. A miracle occurred. Wow, what a miracle. Not belittling Hanukkah, but this is hardly a miracle. And they lit the candelabrum for 8 days. And the next year, the sages instituted those days and made them holy with a recitation of the Hallel and special thanksgiving and prayers and blessings. So it corresponds to the 8 days of the miracle and also the ceremony where they celebrated the rededication of the altar. And you could see again in this, what happens, we're almost done. You can bear with me for another 5 minutes if you don't mind. I don't want to rush as I'm moving like the speed of light here, but I want to get to the real we take away from this. I know Hanukkah's already passed us, but hopefully we'll remember this for next Hanukkah. Once the Greeks are finally fought to exhaustion and they give up trying to conquer the land of Israel, Simon Maccabee, he will have a son, Yochanan Hyrcanus. You can see this guy, John Hyrcanus, who's a very aggressive military leader who will very much expand the territory the Maccabees conquered. And then he will have a son who is Alexander Yanai. And then he'll have 2 sons. Basically, for a period of about 100 years, these different Maccabees will rule the land of Israel. Tragically, by the way, they themselves will be corrupted by their power. They were Kohanim. They were priests. They had the right maybe to take upon themselves the offer of the high priest, but they'll become ethnarchs. Ethnarch is almost like a king. You know what they say about power corrupting and absolute power corrupting? Absolutely. They will themselves be influenced by Hellenized thinking. They'll be influenced by the Sadducees. They will persecute the rabbis. A guy by like Alexander Yanai, whose wife is Shlom Tzion Hamalka. She's a very righteous woman. There's a street named after all these people in Jerusalem. It's amazing. Right next to each other. Her brother will be Shimon ben Shetach, the head of the Sanhedrin. Her husband is murdering rabbis at the same time as she is hiding them. That's how messed up the Maccabees will be. Eventually, it will deteriorate into civil war with these final two guys, and the Romans will show up. We're going to save that for the next class. But it's a tragic story, the Maccabees. They all end up being killed out. None of their descendants survive. They become corrupted. Precisely what their ancestors gave their lives to maintain, which was loyalty to Torah and Judaism, they will themselves end up rejecting. I would say modern irony of ironies. It's interesting that the Maccabees are glorified along with King David by the Crusaders. These are the same Crusaders who slaughter the Jews of Europe, love these guys because they're viewed like King David as holy warriors. They completely neglected the fact that they were Jews because they're murdering the Jews in front of them at the same time. In modern Zionism, and don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-Zionist at all, but they love to glorify the Maccabees and people like King David because, and we should really do a class with you guys. We'll have to ask the rabbis about continuing doing some of their classes on Zionism. Is a fascinating topic. They were viewed as the Jews who fought, not the ones who went like sheep to the slaughter like the Jews in the Holocaust. We love these guys. What's named after them today? Ironically, really bad Israeli beer, Maccabee beer, which I never drink, and the Jewish Olympics, which is doubly ironically sad because the Olympics were I have nothing against sports, although they say that what's the sign of maturity in a Jewish boy when he recognizes that he has a lot greater chance of owning a professional sports team than ever actually playing on one. But to make the Jewish Olympics named after the Maccabees, when this was one of the features of Greek culture that tried to overwhelm Jewish culture, is just ironic to say the least. But that's the modern take on the story. But unfortunately, the Maccabees will end up dying out. But for about 100 years, we will enjoy a kingdom with independence from the Greeks until the Romans show up. And then, of course, in the year 63 BCE, Pompey Magnus, we'll get to this in our next class, will come and complete his absorption of the remaining Greek empires and all North Africa into the Roman Empire. And that will be the end of our independence, but that's for the next class. But I just wanted to end with a little bit of a question of food for thought, and then we are done. If you just bear with me for a couple more minutes, just to think about this for a minute. Okay, Hanukkah was no open miracle, seas didn't split, and firstborn didn't die, and things like that. But which is the bigger miracle? The fact that we, the teeny tiny Jewish people, grossly outnumbered, were able to fight off one of the great world powers who were numerically and militarily and technologically far superior to us, or I'm not belittling the miracle that a flask of oil burned for 8 days. In the grand scheme of miracles that we have in Jewish history, this is about as seemingly insignificant as could be. Yet this is what we focus on. And it's interesting in that if you look at the essence of the conflict, if first of all, look at the word, the way I like to summarize it, I think it's maybe Dennis Prager who said this first. I don't know who. He said, for the Jews, what was holy was beautiful. That was our idea. And for the Greeks, what was beautiful was holy. It was a reverse worldview of reality. Hanukkah is an ideological struggle. Ultimately, what's behind the military struggle was the ideological struggle. If you look at even the word Greece, here's the word Greece in Greek in Greece, Yavan, Yud, Vav, Nun. All these letters are unique in that they stand on one leg. They're not particularly stable, and they have no internalness to them. They're very superficial. There's nothing on the inside of them. Okay. If you flip the word Yavan around, you get the word Noi. Nun, Vav, Yud. What does Noi mean in Hebrew? It means beauty, which is the essence of what Greece is about. The roots, by the way, of Greece, in terms of our understanding of where they come from, is from Noah's son Yefet. And Yefet comes from the word Yofi. Everything about the Greeks was looking at and categorizing, organizing, and appreciating the physical world. It was the externalness, which there is a place for. But when it becomes the dominant idea and tries to smother tries to smother Judaism, then we get a problem. When I was a little kid and I didn't know anything about Judaism, I thought Hanukkah was invented by rabbis, because if little Jewish kids weren't getting presents at the same time as Christians were getting, they would probably convert to Christianity. I don't know if any of you had a similar thought, but I had that idea. The reality is the Christians, December 25th is a completely random date. It has nothing to do with Jesus historically that we know anything about. That's another interesting class, the historical Jesus. But it was deliberately put, Jesus' birthday was put there because the winter solstice, which is the darkest time of the year, was always a time of pagan holidays. And early Christianity wanted to paganize the world by making everything kind of Christian. That's the whole idea behind the tree and all that other stuff too. The reality is Hanukkah really happened at that time. And that time is the darkest time of year. And it's dark physically outside, least light in the northern hemisphere, but it's also what Greece represented. For all of its enlightened culture, Greece represents the ultimate darkness. The reason we're focusing on the menorah is exactly that point, because ultimately this is an ideological struggle. It was the darkness of Greek culture, not knowing its own boundary and trying to overwhelm the light of Judaism and Torah. And it's precisely the reason why the holiday happens at that time, is showing us that it really is the miracle of the menorah, as insignificant as a physical miracle, but what it represents is a much more profound miracle, that the victory spiritually and ideologically of Judaism over Hellenistic pagan culture. Had the Greeks won, there would be no more Judaism. And a lot of other things wouldn't exist also. And to end with one final thought that I heard from by Matas Weinberg, my Rosh Hashiva Blessed Memories nephew, you put a tzadi before the Yavan, you get Zion, you get Zion, which is interesting. There's a connection between. And if you look in Genesis, when Noah is blessing his three sons, well, he curses Ham, but he blesses his two sons, Shem, who we come from, and Yafet, who the Greeks come from, he says, Yaft Elokim liyefet v'yishkon b'ohele Shem. God shall enlarge Yefet, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. There is a place for the beautiful wisdom of Greece. There's a place for the beautiful wisdom of the beauty of the Greek language, but it has to dwell in the tents of Shem. When it coexists and its foundations are in Judaism, then you get a beautiful synthesis. When it tries to overwhelm us, which is the story of Hanukkah and the victory of Hanukkah was about, that's where it gets really dangerous. So Rav Matas Weinberg asked a really interesting question. He said, where do you see the beauty of Yefet dwelling in the tents of Shem? Where did Greek culture meet Jewish ideas and Jewish thinking and Jewish worldview and metamorphosize into two things that have changed the world? One is science, because the Greeks were into observation, but we Jews are into connection. We believe that everything emanates from God. Observation without connection is meaningless. You'd have no science. And the other thing is Christianity, because Christianity is the spreading of monotheism to much of the world, but it comes out of Hellenistic culture meeting with Jewish culture and metamorphosizing into a new religion, which will then wipe out paganism in much of the world and spread a monotheistic idea through the world. So what we're focusing on, again, is the spiritual victory of Hanukkah in what was a very complicated relationship, yet out of that will not only come the survival of the Jewish people, but will come many things that will ultimately alter the world. And the Greeks, unlike us, their empire will not survive. We're still going strong. So we are alive and kicking today. And we read only about these guys in the history books. Guys, that was it. There's a lot of material to absorb. I know, thank you. We went over time by a good few minutes, but hopefully you found that interesting. And you're welcome to visit the website. You can access material there online and contact me and send me feedback, whatever you like. Ask me questions. I'm happy to take a few questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. If anyone wants to have any questions or comments for a couple of minutes, and then I will let you enjoy your Sunday.
First of all, I just want to say thank you. A big round of applause to Ken once again. Phenomenal presentation. Thank you so much. As Ken said, we have a couple of minutes, so if anybody wants to unmute themselves, and feel free, and let's have some questions.
Jews with no questions? How is this possible?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you so much. I may have misunderstood, but when it mentioned about 72 rabbis being taken the Septuagint and then translating it into Hebrew, and everybody had the exact translation, including things like you mentioned at the beginning, from the we to the I. The 72 versus 70, you said there were 70 copies, but there were 72 rabbis?
No, so 72. It was by my slip of my tongue. It was 72 rabbis, the Talmud says. But we call it the Targum Shivim, though. It's called Septuagint. So I don't know the difference between the two. But the Talmudic take is they took 72 rabbis and put them into 72 rooms. So I don't know where the difference in the two comes from. But then again, the Sanhedrin, they said it was 70 rabbis, and either was 71 to avoid a tie. So it's a good question. You picked up on it. You're good at math. Unlike me.
Any other questions? Okay, I guess Ken, you're extremely clear in all your whole presentation.
Or everyone's overwhelmed.
Once again, thank you so much, guys. Don't forget the last session is next Sunday, and that's, as Ken mentioned, going to go to the Roman era. So please join us and spread the word. It will be the same Zoom link as this past time and previous times. So please share it with other people, and there will be a recording. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Hey guys, have a good week. Bye-bye.